Us, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Grand Stream here in another platform, in another part of the interwebs, in the temporary home here of the Grand Stream, Grand Torino. I have a very interesting interview to present to you tonight. Before I always do, please don't forget, smash that like button if you haven't done so. Please hit the subscription bell over here on BitChute if you haven't already set up an account. We'd love to have you join us over here in the temporary home, as I say. We have a 3-month ban over on our YouTube account, but we do expect to resume back over there in and around the 21st, 22nd of December. Please keep an eye out for us, and please hold us dear to your heart. Okay, all jokes aside, I want to bring in my next guest, and I'm delighted to introduce David, who's with me here this evening. David, how are you, sir? Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks, Ron. I'm fine, thank you. Good to talk to you, and really? Thanks for taking.
Yeah, I know you'll find us over here in this recorded version of this thing of ours that we usually used to do twice daily. But we're going to start off this process, David. I noticed during the week the article it was a full page spread retraction in the opinion piece in the Irish Times. We made contact, and I'm delighted that you're able to come here and join us this morning and just give us some background to your decision there, how this came about, this decision, and what is the background to this case?
Well, it was on the basis of two complaints I made about articles that were written by the Irish Times in earlier this year, which were covering the mumps outbreak. Now, last year there was a very big mumps outbreak in Ireland, and there were a number of articles written in the Irish Times before Christmas and after Christmas discussing the outbreak and the rise in numbers. One of the articles I complained about claimed that most of the cases of mumps in Ireland in 2019 were unvaccinated. And then another further article, which I also complained about, was written on March the 11th. And in that one, the Irish Times claimed that almost half of the cases were unvaccinated. So I wrote to the Irish Times, to both journalists, they're two separate journalists, and I asked them what was going on. I mean, both of these stories can't be correct. It's either most or almost half. Which is it? So I wrote to the Irish Times, I wrote to the journalist, and I wrote to the editor, and I had a lot of trouble getting straight answers anyway. But Kevin O'Sullivan, who happens to be the health editor, ex-senior editor of the Irish Times, he wrote the March the 11th article, which claimed that almost half of the cases in 2019 were unvaccinated. And he eventually got back to me and he said, when I asked him for what the source of this article was, he pointed me to Paul Cullen's article, which is the first article I complained about, that said that most of the cases were unvaccinated. So, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense. Like he claimed that an article in his own newspaper was the source for his story. The article that he claims is the source is saying most cases were unvaccinated, and on the basis of that, he wrote an article saying that almost half of them were. So. Anyways, it turns out neither are correct. They published the data on this on a website called Eurosurveillance.org, and on that you can see the paper. I don't know if I've sent you the link, but the paper keeps the statistics from August 2019 to January 2020, covering the mumps outbreak in Ireland. There are approximately just under 4,000 cases of mumps in the country over that period. And of those, where they could establish the vaccine status of people who had mumps, only 12% were unvaccinated. Mm-hmm. So I wrote to them, I told them this, I pointed them to the data, I pointed them to Eurosurveillance.org, and I said, you need to correct this because you're misleading people. You know, you're making out that most people, or almost half, are unvaccinated. In actual fact, it's the opposite. It's the case. It's only a minority that were unvaccinated.
That's correct, yeah.
Yeah, so eventually they changed the first article. But they didn't actually explain why they changed it, and they didn't actually explain which aspect of it they had changed. So anybody who had read the initial article would still be under the false impression that most of the cases were unvaccinated. You know, they didn't draw attention to the article, or really when you change it, you're supposed to give it due prominence. So if you've written an article that makes a false claim, then the idea is that you correct it and publish it in the day's newspaper, saying, "Look, we made a mistake. This is the actual case." Okay,
that's through the code of practice.
That's the code of practice. Yeah, they have a code of practice. I mean, they all sign up to the code of practice. It's the Press Council's code of practice, Press Council of Ireland, and that's. I'd encourage people to actually look at that, because the mainstream media in Ireland is doing a really bad job of reporting on these issues, and there are plenty of people out there are aware of this and could be holding them to account. I mean, it's not an easy process to go through, but it is worth pursuing, because unless we hold these people to account, they're just going to keep on pushing out lies. I mean, that's effectively what this was. I mean, here you have 2 articles making 2 false claims, misleading people and trying to point the finger at unvaccinated people for the mumps epidemic.
I'd be accused of being very hyperbolic in my rhetoric, and particularly in my slights towards blue text journalists. But we can see that paying attention globally, journalism in itself, that the fourth estate has fell into disrepute, and it's only by actions, as you say. We have to hold them to account. People like yourself, your good self, that follow these stories because they affect you personally.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah. No. Yeah. I mean, this is the thing. You see. I've been so skeptical about the mainstream media that I don't buy the Irish Times. I can't stomach it, and occasionally I would glance at it to see, what are they banging on about now, but I mean, lots of people read the Irish Times and assume that what they're reading is factually correct.
Yeah, they have a vested interest that they've been told all their life that this is the news. But I only recently had a conversation with a friend there, and they were having a debate on, and the people that he was having a chat with were in their late 70s. I questioned them on the reporting of the story. We'll say, for argument's sake, the national broadcaster here in Ireland, and the gentleman returned to my friend and said, "It's the news. What are you on about? It's the news." It's like he was so locked into it, he couldn't even see that there might be an alternative position or anything like that. And a great swath of not only our elderly population, but the majority of the population buy into that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was guilty of it myself. I mean, I used to read the Irish Times because I thought, well, that's the paper of record. If it's in there, it has to be at least close to the truth, But, the longer time passes and the more you look at these things, you realize, they're making half the stuff up. Not half the stuff. Okay, that's
they're steering a narrative. They're steering a narrative, and they're no longer clearly no longer objective.
No, they're not objective, because clearly these stories are meant to steer you in a particular direction. They're not reporting the facts clearly and unbiasedly. They're actually, now it's not the first time. They brought a similar case. Or at least they made a similar complaint to the Press Ombudsman 3 years ago about the Irish Independent.
Yeah. And
they, that was, eventually I agreed that they just print a correction. They ran a similar story. Actually, I have it here in front of me. I'll just read you. So that was on May the 6th, 2017, the Irish Independent. That was a Saturday. They had to print a correction. And I'll just quickly read the question to you. It says, in an article headed "Mumps Case Surged by 900% in just 6 years," published in the Irish Independent on March the 18th, 2017, a HSE spokesperson was quoted as saying that most of those affected had not had the MMR, measles, mumps and rubella vaccine. Next paragraph, this was incorrect. The Health Protection Surveillance Centre has stated that only 10% of those affected with mumps had not had the vaccine in 2015. So, the Irish Times one, are you still there?
Yeah, still here. Go ahead.
Yeah, the Irish Times one it's not an isolated incident. This is part of a pattern. In actual fact, even the Irish Times itself wrote an article before December. Now, since it's interesting. Since that decision was published, I was contacted by somebody who had submitted a letter to the editor in December of 2019 on back of an article that he'd read there, which made a similar claim, most of these cases. And he outlined the problem with the article and highlighted the mistakes in the same way that I had done. So that's December 2019. Like that's, 2 months before the February article that was incorrect, and 3 months before the March article was incorrect. So the editor of the Irish Times can't claim that he didn't know that there was an issue with these. He can't claim that this is an oversight or somehow it's a mistake. Like, it's been pointed out to them repeatedly, and he's ignored it.
Why do you think that is? I mean, are we, just to go back on our previous statement, that they're more likely to be steering a narrative when we see the likes of, in our own situation here in the Republic of Ireland, Stephen Donnelly, now the new Minister for Health, bringing on 2 new mainstream, more or less, journalists. It's a common theme, but to control their PR. And one of her first actions in one of the first in a line of interviews that he was having as the health minister, one of the reporters, I'm presuming it was Josiah Burke from the Burke broadcast, was questioning the minister on the figures, and the new PR consultant was basically holding court and stopping any further questions being asked. And in various other in various other interactions with the health minister as well, the journalists have been telling journalists to not ask pointed questions as such. Crazy stuff.
Yeah, awkward questions. Yeah, questions that they don't want to tell the answer to. I mean, this is, there is a major problem here. Major problem in Ireland. We don't really have a properly functioning press. It's left to people like yourself, independent, socially aware people trying to actually.
Alt media presence. The alt media is growing, David. That's why it's important that we support and push out, because people like you wouldn't get a platform. People in their most day-to-day wouldn't have the attention, time to spend through your links to read the various complaints that you've been pushing out through the years, and you've been holding them to account as a citizen. Nothing completely due to you, because it is personal to you. Take us back to your involvement, as I said, your history, and why you became so acutely aware of, so we say, vaccines, and why they're so important to you.
Sure. Well, when I was 13, I was diagnosed with an immune disorder. It was hypogammaglobulinemia. It's quite a rare thing in those days. I mean, the immune disorders weren't something that you heard people talking about frequently. Although at that time, that was when the AIDS epidemic broke out. So there was a bit of fear around it when I got the diagnosis. And I remember somebody in school joking, "Oh, you've got AIDS," but no, it wasn't that serious. But it was a problem that had to be treated. And I was taken, the person that looked after me was a Professor Greeley. He would travel up to the Children's Hospital in Crumlin once a month from Galway. I think it must have been the University Hospital in Galway. And he recommended that as for treatment, I would receive plasma transfusions. Plasma is a blood product, and that would help boost the antibodies in my body, help to fight off infections. So I was getting recurring infections. That's a technology
that Italy are currently using as well, as a range of effects for the COVID situation over there, the plasma replacement.
Okay, well, this is a long time ago now, so it was kind of an unusual situation, but so the idea was that once a month I'd go in and get these plasma transfusions. Now, very early on, there was an incident. I'd go over. It was a 24-hour gig. You go in, you'd be hooked up, put in a bed, intravenously given the plasma, and then stay there overnight, and the next day you go home. And it did help, but I think the first or second time I got the transfusion, there was a problem. And my parents were there, and they went down for coffee to the coffee shop after an hour or two. And while they were gone, I had an allergic reaction. So hives started appearing in my face and my arms. And when they came back, they were, concerned, and they talked to the nurse, and the nurse was not too bothered. But my mother said, "Well, I'm not happy. I mean, this is clearly not right. Like, can you contact a consultant?" And the nurse said, "Well, there are no consultants here. I mean, it's the weekend. I think it might have been actually the August bank holiday weekend. it's the weekend. There's no consultants on here. So she said, well, I have the number for Professor Greeley in Galway. And she said, well, I don't think you should call him now at this hour. And my mother insisted. She says, no, I'm going to ring him. And he rang, and he put a stop to the whole thing. He said, no, take him off that. Clearly the plasma, and it came frozen. It was being imported.
Right.
And it came in frozen and had to be defrosted. He reckoned that it hadn't been properly defrosted, and that was what was happening. He said,
wow.
My son, at that stage, my tongue had started to swell, and he said, if you don't get that off him immediately, there's a danger of his tongue swelling to the point that he'll actually suffocate. Yeah, suffocate. So that was a real lesson in life. You know, my mother challenged the nurse and made the call to the consultants. I mean, you have to remember, I mean, consultants here and even more back then are held in such high esteem that, you know, they're
yes, I remember.
You know, they're nearly a law to themselves, another class of citizen. But anyway, my mother had, you know, she knew what the thing to do was, and she had the courage to question it. And I thought, well, that's the lesson in life there, you know.
Absolutely,
you know,
fantastic.
Fear of questioning medical authority can actually cost you your life. You see, that's the. So anyway, after that, another interesting thing happened. When next time we saw the professor, he recommended that my mother try to get together some relatives and to be donors, you know, so we'd have our own pool of donors rather than relying on outside products, because he wasn't convinced of the screening procedures in place for the blood products that were being used in the country at the time. Now, this is, you have to remember, this is about 1984, around that time, 1985.
Different world.
Yeah, well, interestingly, he was proved to be right, because in 1994, the hepatitis C scandal came to light, and it was clear that he was right, that the screening procedures weren't in place, and as a result, I think you're into the hundreds, possibly thousands of Irish women, mostly this anti-D scandal, they developed hepatitis C, and quite a lot of them died. You know, so, and other people contracted HIV. So, you know,
big scandal here.
Yeah, big scandal here. So the point is, you have to keep an eye on these things. Anyway, so that would have piqued my interest, let's say, in immunology. So fast forward now, let's skip over a lot of things, but eventually, you know, it comes to the time about 15 years ago, and my own children are on the way, and I still had health problems, but the only way I'd been able to really get a handle on them, to improve my quality of life, was through alternative therapies, and mostly through diet. And so I would go to these talks and listen to people talking about how they cured themselves. And I came across one website called the Weston Price Foundation, which is a good website. Weston A. Price, he was a dentist. And there's a website there that's dedicated to him. And they talked mostly about nutrition, but they also talked about vaccines and the dangers of vaccines. And so that kind of set off alarm bells. And I started looking into it more, because I knew it was going to be something that would come up when my own children were born. And and the more I dug into it, the more and more convinced I became that they're not as safe as we're told. And really, I'm not telling anybody, I just want to be clear now, I'm not saying to anybody not to vaccinate the children. Not to vaccinate the children. What I am saying is that, you know, I'm in favor of the principle of informed consent. People need to educate themselves, and they need to weigh up the pros and cons for each vaccine and make their own decision. And they can't just rely on one or two sources, particularly, as is made clear now, you can't rely on people like the Irish Times to steer you in the direction of where they want to bring you. You know, they have vested interest. I mean, a lot of their revenue comes from the HSC, the pharmaceutical industry.
Government, so a lot of government spending.
A lot of government spending, yeah. So they're very much pro what the government want to do, you know, and so you have to be wary. And one of the reasons I made this complaint is to point out, it's just to draw attention for people, that, you know, these people cannot be trusted. You can't just rely on it. I mean, you have to be these days your own fact checker.
Yes.
You can't just, you know, that's the situation we're in. You have to actually go and check, where's he's saying this, but is that true? And where is he getting the information for this? And then double check it, and then listen to somebody who's telling the other side of the story. And then you make your own mind up, and then you can make a responsible decision. Now it does take it does require responsibility. Like if you're going to not vaccinate, then you have to protect your children in other ways, and you have to be very conscious of the diet and stuff like that, and all that kind of thing. Anyway,
100%.
Yeah.
But sorry, David, and I hope it doesn't steer us to a side or too much of an aside. But you would think with the talk of vaccinations or the talk of therapeutics, or that they should be pushing healthy lifestyles more on the nutrition side of it, as you say, regular exercise. But we're steering towards the vaccinations.
Yes.
Probably too much of an aside.
No. I mean, actually, it was interesting at the beginning of this whole lockdown thing that they kept on telling people to stay indoors, and I was thinking, it was known then. It's known for a long time that vitamin D. I mean, they're talking about it now. I heard Lisa O'Neill on Pat Kenny's show saying, "Oh yes, actually, vitamin D does have a prophylactic effect against COVID-19." But why weren't they saying this back in March and April when we actually had the sunshine and people could be out there getting advantage of it? I mean,
but particularly our elderly, the very people.
I was just going to say that, particularly the elderly, because I noticed at the time that the elderly around the area where I live were staying indoors. And I was thinking, my God, this is the time they need to be out there, going for a walk, and we don't live in a very populated area. They could easily go for a walk and everybody would stay clear of them. And they get the sunshine. So that seemed extraordinary to me. Very, very simple advice. Go out, get some walk, get some fresh air, and
protect yourself.
Protect yourself. Yeah. So, those things are cheap. That's part of the problem. Nobody makes money out of vitamin D from the sun.
But that's gonna make me jump across to the conflict of interest. We see Professor Valence in the United States that's leading the American medical expert. He has a 600,000 investment in the very same company that's going to start producing these vaccinations that can be, as you're going to steer us towards in relation with the mumps, that they will probably need continual boosters if they have what's known as the waning effect or secondary failure.
Yeah, actually, it is worthwhile mentioning that, because that puts the complaints into context. So, I mean, mumps. I don't want to underestimate mumps. Mumps, actually, if you don't look after yourself when you have mumps, yes, of course, you can actually cause complications. So a child now, usually it was just children who got mumps, and it's changed now as a result of the vaccine and the introduction of the vaccine. But when your child got mumps, they had to stay indoors to get a lot of rest. And part of the problem is that it's changed to adults, and adults are less likely to rest, let's say, and also they're more prone to complications. In relation to the mumps vaccine, any vaccine, in fact, they talk about primary failure or secondary failure. Primary failure is when the vaccine doesn't actually produce the antibodies that they wanted. There's no seroconversion, they call it, and as a result, it doesn't have the prophylactic effect that it was intended to do from the start. So you get the vaccine and it has no effect, and a couple of weeks later, you get the illness anyway. Secondary failure, on the other hand, is what you're referring to there, is waning. So over time, it's becoming more and more apparent, particularly with the MMR vaccine, that the effect wanes over a period of time. And by the time, 10 years after having had it, the second shot, the effect is much, much lower. So, and that is the reason why we're seeing outbreaks now in 15 to 24-year-olds. And that is the reason. Now, I've actually, I don't know whether I should cut into this now, but I wrote to Kevin Kelleher of the HSC to ask him about this specific problem. And I could read you his response because it's interesting.
Yeah, please do. Go ahead.
Just 1 second. So I sent him a series of questions. Specifically related to mumps, because I asked them why if this was such a serious disease, it didn't become a notifiable disease in Ireland until the MMR vaccine was introduced. Anyway, but as regards the waning of the effect, Yeah, here it is here. I asked them, if the incidence of mumps continues to increase in the post-puberty age group, at what point would the HSC consider abandoning the mumps vaccine because it was causing more problems than it is solving? Does such a tipping point exist? Or is the HSC committed to vaccinating for mumps regardless of the outcome? Now, his answer is, it is important to remember that the increase in post-puberty mumps and the associated complications is not a direct result of the childhood vaccination program, but rather a manifestation of the combination of waning immunity over time and historical suboptimal vaccination rates in childhood. Now, he's actually contradicted himself there in the one sentence. He's saying the increase in post-puberty mumps is not a direct consequence of the childhood vaccination program, but it's actually a combination of waning immunity over time. Now, waning immunity over time can only refer to the vaccine because, immunity from having had the mumps, actual mumps, wild mumps, confers lifelong immunity. So he's contradicted himself there. It makes absolutely no sense. Mm-hmm. And that is the problem, because it's pushed mumps. The introduction of the vaccine has pushed the incidence of mumps up into the higher age bracket. It used to be that people who got mumps were under the age of 12 generally, and they would be, they get it, they'd be a little bit sick. Mm-hmm. It's probably, it's not as sick as even problematic as probably even the chickenpox. Like, it's around that seriousness. But after they'd had it, then they'd have lifelong immunity and they wouldn't have to worry about it again. And it's been there for literally thousands of years. We've been dealing with this. It was never a panic. And the real question is, why was it included in the MMR vaccine? That's the question I would be asking. And because when the MMR vaccine was rolled out, that's when they introduced that. That was the first time we'd had a mumps vaccine here. We didn't have mumps vaccines before that.
Yeah, that refers back to that article from the Dr. David Nolan that you pulled back out from the archives as well. But there was no historical record kept from 1988 or previous to 1988, as you say, when the MMR vaccine came out, because, as you said, just to reiterate the point, that it wasn't a notifiable communicable disease of much concern.
No, so so a notifiable disease means, like, the GP sees it, he has to notify the HSC, say, look, we have a case here and we need to keep an eye on it, and the HSC keep an eye on all those things. Now, there wasn't a notifiable disease before 1988, the year that the MMR was rolled out. Mm-hmm. So, and the reason for that was, it wasn't that there wasn't a mumps vaccine available. There was a mumps vaccine available. In fact, it's they had a mumps vaccine as far back as 1948, and the one that they're using now, I think that's been around since 1967. So it was being administered in America. So we were aware. The health authority were aware that there was a mumps vaccine. If they'd wanted to, they could have included it as part of the schedule here. They decided it wasn't sufficiently problematic enough to warrant it. So it wasn't included. So the only reason we have a mumps vaccine at all, as he acknowledges later on in answer to one of my other questions, is that the only reason we have it all is because the vaccine was available. And it's not really available. It was like, if you want the measles or rubella vaccinations, you're going to have to take this, because they withdrew, at that time, the single vaccines option. So we weren't given a choice. And now we're seeing the consequences, you see, because at the time, the idea was you get 2 shots of this and you have lifelong immunity. Now it's quite apparent that the immunity wanes. In 2002, the National Immunization Advisory Committee, 2002, so what's that, 18 years ago? And that's 14 years after the introduction of the vaccine. Now, back at that stage, they said that the MMR vaccine is very effective, with up to 99% of those receiving 2 doses developing immunity, and 90% after 1 dose. So they're saying if you got, so back in 2002, people were told, you got 2 doses of this,
you're good to go.
99% of people are now that's clearly waned. They've dialed that number down now. You can get 2 doses, and the average protection you get from it is 88%. And some people, after 2 doses, their protection is only, they've measured 35%, so that's So they didn't know. So you see, this is part of the thing about vaccines. It's like when they're rolled out, there's all these, great plans for the future, and in actual fact, they're talking about eliminating mumps altogether from the planet. Like with this, I mean, the National Immunization Advisory Committee are talking about, like, well, if everybody gets this and we have up 95% take up rate, then we'll have no mumps.
Yeah,
but actually, since but that hasn't worked out. I mean, because they've had now outbreaks in populations where everybody's been vaccinated. Most recently, they had this warship this USS Henry, I think it's called.
That's correct.
And they had this rolling outbreak of mumps. And the thing about the warships, the USS Navy, is that, you work for the Navy, I think they own you. They own you, don't they? You're their property. And they give you the vaccines. You don't, even if you had them as a child, you get them all again. Now, so they would have had them, anybody on that ship would have had them. And then when it became apparent that somebody on the ship had it, everybody else got a booster shot. But they couldn't land this ship. They couldn't dock the ship for, I think it was something like 18 months, because basically it was a rolling outbreak, and as soon as it died down somewhere, it flare up again. So there you have, there's proof that no matter, you can vaccinate the whole population of the planet, if you could even do such a thing, but you're not going to eradicate mumps. You can't eliminate it. At least, it doesn't appear to be effective enough to eliminate it, particularly looking at this situation,
Make the comparison in that situation. We have a clear indicator now of a causality, as we say, between the mumps vaccines, and now it's transpiring, and there's more and more clear evidence coming through that the vaccines are waning and boosters will be required. Could that be made a comparison here in this situation?
Well, yes. I mean, I think so. I mean, it's important to bear this mumps story in mind when you're thinking about the introduction of a new vaccine, because when the promises for what mumps could do were quite extreme, and they haven't panned out. But they couldn't have known. You see how this is the part of the problem. Like you're giving something that's you're hoping will give lifelong immunity, or claiming that will give lifelong immunity. But how do you know? You haven't proven it. The only way to prove it is to give it to one group, not give it to another group, and then follow them over the course of their life, and then see what happens. And then you can say, well, look, none of these people developed this thing, so that's a pretty good indicator that this offers lifelong immunity. Now, those kind of studies just aren't done. They're not done on any vaccine. I mean, actually, in fact, the studies that are done on vaccines aren't great. Like, they're not sufficient. I mean,
given that,
gold standard.
Given that as well, David. Sorry, David. I know I'm cutting across. Given that standard as well, that for the mumps, and you'll understand this as well, that they had a clear Koch's postulate. By Koch's postulate, they were able to identify what mumps is. We don't even have a Koch's postulate for COVID-19, yet they were ramping up and producing a vaccine for something they don't even have clear indications what that hasn't passed the necessary criteria to be identified.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense to me. No, I don't know enough about that kind of thing. Like, I mean, it does. It sounds on the face of it to be. It just doesn't make sense, does it?
No. But I was cutting across you, David. There, sorry. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to make the point. Like in relation to the testing, you see, most people assume that these things have been tested so well that there can be no problems with them. But the gold standard in medicine, for testing something like this would be, or a very, very high standard would be the double-blind
placebo.
Double-blind controlled group placebo. So but those tests aren't done. So very few of them have been done on vaccines. Where you give one group the vaccine, you give the other group a placebo. Now, a true inert placebo, like a saline solution or whatever. So there's nothing actually in it, and the double blind meaning you don't know which group has it, and the group that the people that get it, they don't know either. And then double blind randomized control group. That's the word I was looking for. So there was actually one done on the BCG vaccine, and that was a large-scale study. It was done in southern India in the early 70s. I think the World Health Organization were involved. And it involved about 500,000 people. So BCG protects against TB. So they gave half this group the vaccine and half a genuine placebo. There was nothing in the other one. And then they followed them over years. There was a follow-up study done about 14 years later, and they discovered that there was no protective effect. No, in fact, if you'd had the vaccine, you were slightly more likely to develop TB. So that's the only very large-scale, double-blind, randomized control group study using a proper placebo that's ever been done on a vaccine. I mean, that's quite remarkable. Most people think that these things have been tested like until the cows come home. But it's not quite that way at all,
Okay, given everything that we've spoken up on, David, and we're coming up into the last 5 or 10 minutes now. Let's jump into, from your perspective, strategies going forward. What can people do? I mean, it's clear to me. It's obviously get informed. You need to understand what informed consent is. We need to be inquiring and pushing and asking what is actually in this vaccine that you're pumping into my child, and why is it mandatory? Is this medical incursion warranted, given the fact of what we're seeing with the empirical evidence of the survivability of this virus, the infection rates, and then with the mandatory mask wearing as well, kind of compounding and giving people another placebo effect that the mask can in fact help them in their fight to protect others, which is, going back to the very start, the Hegelian dialect that's being introduced to us, that I feel it's funneling down what's known as the mellow trap, where the people are sort of startled into getting this reaction and are funneled down into the mallow trap, and are held in a cage of fear. That's pretty much where they have now, and that's how our media are sort of creating that and enforcing it and hyping it up, and our population, through years of indoctrination, and I'm sorry to go back to kind of a political bent, and I'm just trying to describe it as I see it, are being held now inside that metal trap because of the government's drive and narrative to support their claims that vaccines are going to work, when we've all got so many, clearly there are so many questions to ask, and we don't seem to have this any sort of platform or any sort of credence. You're instantly dismissed as far right, or your livelihood is threatened, and you're cast aside. You're marginalized, as as our Taoiseach has said.
Yeah, I know. It's a very dangerous situation. We don't have a proper media that's holding people to account. They're not asking the right questions. All we seem to get really is only propaganda. I mean, the fact that they've hired a PR company to do their business for them is ridiculous. Like PR. I mean, Edward Bernays was the guy who called that out. Like, he said, it's he wanted to use the proper word for it, which is propaganda. I mean, that's what it is. It's propaganda. And that's a propaganda machine there being employed by the government. Why do they need a propaganda machine? And as regards to the vaccine that they're supposedly working on and they're going to roll out, I mean, how ridiculous is it to think that you could produce something that quickly that's going to be safe? I mean, how can you do the tests? I mean, supposedly as well, they're using new technologies. So, you need long-term studies on vaccines to determine whether they're safe, what the long-term effects. I mean, a vaccine supposedly gives you long-term effects, but they're not studied over the long term. You don't give them and then watch for 10, 15, 20 years to see how people react to them. Now, I know that supposedly this is a dire situation. I mean, you really have to question that, though. I mean, generally, I think you can't rely on the mainstream media, unfortunately. The reason I wanted that complaint published, and I was happy that it was, is that people, maybe make some people, one or two people, even that would be a success, to stop and start and think, well, hold on a second, why are these people being corrected on such a fundamentally important matter? Are they trustworthy? I mean, do I need to go look somewhere else and question what I'm being told here? Now, as regards parents looking into vaccinating their children, your doctors mean well, but it's hard to keep up with the amount of data that's been pushed at these people. I mean, when we were children, there was a handful of vaccines. My parents probably had 3. Now you're talking about, like, when you the combined shots and over different dates add up to something like 70 plus. I mean, so how would you even get your head around that much information? But you have to, unfortunately, go do your own homework. And informed consent means informing yourself, not being informed by others. Or that's more like consumed consent. It's a
personal responsibility. Pushback on TDs, pushback on the doctors, pushback or join organisations that are supporting it and speaking against the narrative and asking them, can we have a debate, at least a national debate, And like I would say, the perfect antidote for that would be for Luke O'Neill to debate Professor Dolores Cahill.
Absolutely. Here. What is the harm in debating? Really? I mean, everybody's asking these questions outside of the media anyway. They want answers. They want to hear these people talk to each other and challenge each other because they're totally confused. You're hearing there's basically two different narratives going here. So people are thinking, well, who the hell would trust here? And just on it does occur to me, there's one thing I wanted to just mention briefly before I went, is that, people might be thinking, well, who is this guy? He's not a medic. And I'm not a medic. I don't have medical training. Anything I'm telling you is stuff I've gleaned from reading books and reading the arguments for and against on either side, and my own personal interest. But I probably know as much as Paul Cullen, who's the health editor of the Irish Times. Now, Paul Cullen, just before Christmas, in one of his articles, claimed, it's quite extraordinary. Like he says, even if you've had mumps, there is no such thing as lifelong immunity. Now, that's an extraordinary claim that I've read absolutely nowhere. I mean, I thought the most uncontroversial fact is that once you've had mumps, you're absolutely, you have lifelong immunity. So, okay, don't believe me, but please don't just assume that because somebody's the health editor of the Irish Times, that he knows what he's talking about and that he can be taken as a seriously, sound source of information.
David, that's absolutely a perfect point, a perfect place to leave it there right now. I want to thank you so very much for coming on and sharing your perspective and your side of the story here in relation to the retraction from the Irish Times and the correction. David, thanks very much for all your work.
Okay, thanks a million, Ron, and best of luck to you. And the truth will prevail.
That's what we all stand for. God bless.
Okay, take care, Ron. All the best.
Ladies and gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining me on this episode of the Grand Stream. Keep an eye out for further updates as we traverse this unknown territory, as we migrate into independent platforms away from YouTube. But we will be back in 3 months' time. I want to thank Mr. David Quinn for joining me on this episode of the show. I hope it's given you pause for thought. I hope it's given you some leeway to do your own investigations. Please, before I let you go, why not smash that like button, hit the subscription button, and also the bell. Please leave your thoughts, comments, and witticisms in the comment section down below. Yes, even over here on BitChute, we do have a comment section. We do love to read through them. As you know, we are now deplatformed and now demonetized and also demonetized. We really much appreciate your continued support over on the Gran Torino website, World Wide Web, grantorino.ie/donations. A list also in the description box down on how you may support the platform. And don't forget our PO Box 13179 Wicklow, if you're ever mind to send us a mail there. We'd love to read through your thoughts. I'll see you again on the next episode, wherever it may be. Look after yourselves. God bless us.